The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm. Now, let's start deeping. Hey, did you forget that we were recording a podcast today?
No, why?
Because you were late.
Right.
Did the time change that happened a week or two ago, is it still messing with you?
Yes.
Do you think that we should keep daylight savings time and the time change?
I understand it's useful, but man, I really hate it when we actually have to turn back the clocks.
Is it actually useful, though?
I mean, I like having sunlight.
Okay, but the sun is going to be there regardless. So does daylight savings time improve that?
I mean, at times it shifts the sun to more when I can use it.
But if you can use it more, then why not just stay on daylight savings time? Why go back?
That's a good point.
So, topic is going to be daylight savings time, but more than that, we're also going to be looking at just time tracking in general, in terms of what base we're using for time, whether or not cyclic time is actually what we should stay on, as well as daylight savings time. So those are going to be, I think, the three main topics. So what should we start with?
Well, why don't we start with cyclic time? And what is that, by the way?
Well, I mean, we always think of, in time travel, we think of timelines, right?
Right.
But time is not made out of lines. It's made out of circles. That's why clocks are round.
I mean, I couldn't imagine a clock as a line.
Right. It wouldn't be efficient to store things like that. And clocks are round because we have cyclic time. You have 1 second is kind of our unit of time, essentially. And 60 seconds makes up a minute. Once the clock makes one cycle of a minute, it ticks over on the minute hand. Once that minute hand goes around 60 times, that makes one tick on the hour hand, and it repeats. That's what I mean by cyclic time.
Okay, that makes sense.
So we have 1 second is our unit, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day. Perfect. Everything is hunky-dory, right?
The 60-60-24 does get me a little bit.
Which we can come back to in terms of what are the bases of the numbers. We have base 24 for days and base 60 for minutes and hours, which we'll come back to why that is and whether or not it's a good idea. We'll touch on that later. But for right now, cyclic time in general. The problem with cyclic time being the fact that if your day-night cycle is slightly off of that cycle, that cyclic time frame, you have problems. That's where we encounter leap years, leap seconds, if you haven't heard of that, where the length of a day is not actually 60 times 60 times 24. So there are, in an official day, 86,400 seconds, and that's what the multiplication of the cyclic times are. So 60 times 60 times 24 seconds, minutes, hours, 86,400. That's not the actual length of a solar day. So the time that it takes for the Earth to complete exactly one rotation is not that time relative to the sun. So your clock starts shifting by on the order of a few seconds a day. It's not super noticeable, but it adds up.
Right, but it's going to add up over a really long time.
Yes, but every 4 years, we have approximately an extra day. I believe the actual length of a year is approximately 365.26 something days. So that extra 0.26 means that we need to have an extra day every 4 years, approximately. I think it's, or is it a little less than 0.26? So, something along those lines. That every 4 years we have a leap year, meaning that we have an extra day. But sometimes, because it's slightly over that, we have too many days made up, and we have to skip our leap year. So we leap a leap year.
Wait, that's a thing?
That's a thing. So every 4 years, you have a leap day to prevent it from, prevent the calendars from shifting. And then I think it's every 100 years, you skip the leap year. But then every 400 years, you don't skip the leap year.
Because of course we have to make it complicated.
Yeah, you have to make it complicated. But when the Gregorian calendar was being developed, which I believe we're currently using the Gregorian, when that was being developed, the astronomers that were trying to match the number of days to the year by looking at the stars determined, okay, every 4 years have a leap day, every 100 years don't have a leap day when you should, and then every 400 skip the skip of the extra day, which gets complicated, but it ended up making clocks or calendars specifically accurate out to several thousand years.
That's pretty good.
It was good enough when it was being developed in the latter half of the second millennium. So it was good enough for them. We don't have to worry about that for a while, and we will probably end up changing how we track time by the time it matters. So years are another example of cyclic time because the Earth revolves once around the sun, revolves once around the sun. That's an example of a cycle, and it's approximately 365 days, a little bit over. So 365, we don't really have a choice in how long that takes.
Right.
That the year-to-day ratio, not something that we're going to be able to affect in the near future. Changing the speed of the orbit or the speed of the Earth, not something we're going to be able to do. We can, however, change the length of a second. So you may ask, why do we have 1 second not just equal? Why don't we change the length of a second to be equal to an even fraction of a day?
I mean, that sounds pretty easy.
It sounds like it would be easy, but the problem is the Earth does not spin at a consistent rate. It spins at a very consistent rate, but not perfectly consistent.
So some days could have more seconds than others.
Yes, and we're not talking about daylight. We're talking about actual rotation rate of the Earth. That the moon's effect on the Earth, you're familiar with tides, right?
Oh, yeah.
The way that tides interact with the moon causes the moon to get slightly further away. It basically adds energy to the moon's orbit, making it orbit faster, which makes it move further away from the Earth. I won't get super in detail into the exact orbital mechanics, but the tides are pushing away the moon, effectively. Technically, they're pulling away the moon, but again, orbital mechanic specifics.
That's a little bit outside of this podcast.
That energy has to come from somewhere. That energy comes from the rotation rate of the Earth, which means the Earth is slowing down. But it's slowing down at a very, very slow rate. So right now, we're something like 13 microseconds off per day from the normal leap day schedule. So every once in a while, we'll have a leap second to make sure that the days don't continue shifting. But the frequency with which we have to take a leap second is increasing slightly, like on the order of a few microseconds per century, I believe it is, based on the rate of the Earth slowing down. But we still have to take those leap seconds to keep our clocks matched, which means if we wanted to just change the length of a second to make it an even multiple of a day, we would have to constantly change how long a second is.
Could you imagine updating your clocks all that time?
Right. And it's not just updating how many seconds is it going to take, because that's always going to be the same number, but the duration of a second. So the first, I think, axiom that we should be facing is, should the length of a second change?
I mean, if we're going to call it a unit of measure, no.
And what is the purpose of a unit? The purpose of a unit is to give you something to build everything else off of.
Right. And it shouldn't change.
Right. Or at least it should change as infrequently as possible.
Right.
So it's
happened once in a very rare while that something's changed.
Right. And it's usually not because we're changing our paradigm, but it's because we're changing our precision. So for instance, the length of a kilogram, or the length of a kilogram, the length of a meter or the weight of a kilogram, mass of a kilogram, that has changed over the years as we've increased precision. But it has changed very, very slightly, and the amount of change decreases every time we do it. Because we're just trying to narrow down, okay, exactly how much mass should be equivalent to a kilogram. And as an example, the kilogram is now defined as a specific number of a particular isotope of silicon atoms. That's
Wow.
That's the official definition of a kilogram. A meter is defined as a particular distance that light travels in a fraction of a second.
Which makes sense. Hard to measure, but
it's going to be hard to
got a
measure,
reason.
but what we're trying to do is use natural constants. So atoms are not going to change their mass, assuming you use the same exact atoms. Atoms are not going to change their mass. They'll change their weight, but not change their mass. And light is always going to travel at the same speed. So with those, we can build our units of measure to make sure that they don't change. And the only modifications that we've made to them and slight adjustments is when we change the precision. So with a second, the length of a second may have slightly changed. It may have been 86,400th of a day back when it was first conceived. But as we now are getting to the point of measuring number of oscillations of a cesium atom at a particular temperature range, which is very specific, that's an atomic clock uses that. That is much more precise than being based on the length of a day. And I want to say it will be off by a second in millions or billions of years.
So we don't really have to worry about anything.
Right. But with that higher level of precision, we need to now define what a second is. So changing the length of the duration of a second is not something practical, because you would have to keep that in mind when comparing it to previous records of how long
Right.
how long did this process take? And when you have, let's say, 5.3444587, once you get to several decimal places, if you slightly change the length of a second, those numbers may not be valid, or they would need to be completely converted, which means historical records will become very, very difficult to track, which is something that we already see with calendars.
Oh, yeah.
But at least with calendars, generally speaking, you want to get it down to the year or the time of year where seasons matter, as opposed to
Right.
the
If you're off
exact
by a few
day.
days, it's not going to matter in those cases. You just want to know it was winter in this year for the most part.
Right. So, but the problem with the second is if you change it slightly, that can change a lot of implications in terms of just what is the distance of a light second,
Exactly.
which may not matter to you, but it matters in astrophysics. How many oscillations are there per second of a hydrogen atom? And you may not think that that matters too much, but oscillations per second is something used all the time in radio. For instance, FM radio is frequency modulation. If you slightly change the length of a second, then the number frequency will change.
Could you imagine resetting your car radio all the time?
And specifically resetting it all the time based on when we change the length of a second.
Yeah, that's not going to go over well.
Right. So the unit of 1 second, while increasing in precision, should remain as constant as possible.
Yes.
Okay. That leads us into cyclic time, because if we can't adjust the length of a second, we have to adjust how we handle cycles. And that's what leap days and leap seconds attempt to do. That as we fall off of basically the Earth's clock, we need to adjust for that using leap days or leap seconds. Is that a reasonable solution?
I mean, if we can't change a second, that limits us a bit in what we can do.
So what are our options?
Well, we can do what we do today, where we add leap seconds and leap days. Maybe one time we'll get to a leap hour. I highly doubt that'll happen, because we'll be having seconds instead.
And the leap days are to compensate for the difference of ratio between the revolution of the Earth around the sun and the revolution of the rotation of the Earth around its axis. So year versus day, and we can't change that fraction. So that comes in the form of skipping an entire day. The second is because of the fact that the Earth is slowing down. So the total length of a day is changing, and we're trying to keep that in sync with our current definition of what a clock day is.
Right.
So
that is reliant on our current definition.
Right. Which, in terms of what we currently have with how we measure cyclic time, seconds and days are the only types of jumps that we are really going to be doing. because they're adjusting for different things. They're adjusting for the slowing of the Earth, and then they're in the seconds, and the days is compensating for just the difference between a year and a day.
All right. So keeping that in mind, if we're not going to touch seconds, what about touching days and changing the length of a day instead?
We can change the length of a clock day. The problem is then that will have a slightly off ratio between the length of our clock day and the length of a solar day. So a solar day is how long does it take for the sun to effectively return to the same spot that it was in the sky yesterday. If we define, let's say, a clock day to be the length of 15 hours, we could do that. And when I say 15 hours, I mean the length that 15 hours currently takes. That's fine. It'll work on the first day. And then the second day, you'll be early in the morning. Like noon, 15 hours from noon is 3 in the morning. And then that would be your new noon.
That would certainly feel weird.
It would feel weird. And I'm using this as a hyperbolic example of if we set it slightly off of what the length of an actual solar day is, then it will shift. It's not going to shift because we're not going to be stupid and say, all right, let's just arbitrarily say it's 9 hours less than an actual solar day. We're going to try to get it close to a solar day, but if it's slightly off at all,
somebody's going to notice.
It's going to eventually add up and notice, and then we'll need leap seconds or leap days. The way around that would be change the length of a second such that there's an even fraction, that the ratio between a day and then a second is a rational number, so that after a certain number of cycles, it repeats exactly. The problem is when that number slightly changes, that rational number becomes inaccurate. So you can't perfectly match perfect timekeeping with a day cycle or a year cycle because those values constantly change over time ever so slightly. So you will always get clock drift no matter what, which is why changing the length of your second is unfeasible because you will always have to be changing it. And every time you have to change it, you would have to reconvert all older numbers, which becomes incredibly burdensome, makes you question all records, particularly around that second duration point. So it's not a good idea. We can't just lock things into place because of the fact that they change. And solar day makes sense that we track around that because the sun is our greatest resource in terms of energy and allowing us to do things outside without artificial lighting.
It's nice.
It is. It's also really healthy to be out in the sun. Not for extended periods of time because then that's how you get skin cancer. But it is good to be outside. If you're feeling depressed, go outside. It will very likely help. So solar time is important because we as creatures that evolved on Earth have based our rhythmic cycles of our own internal timekeeping around the day cycle. And even that is approximate, though. There have been studies done on if you put someone in an area that they're completely disconnected from the sun, what do you think happens in terms of their sleep schedule?
Doesn't it kind of go a little bit crazy? Like it's not quite the same as a 24-hour day.
Yes, but it's not that far off. It's not like you sleep every 12 hours for 3 hours at a time. It's not that crazy. On average, at least when studies have been done on this, I believe people normally settle down to about a 26-hour day.
So it's not that far off.
Right, sleeping slightly longer and staying up slightly longer, so it's 26 hours instead of 24 hours. But that's still off, which means if you had someone that is ignoring the sun, or if we set it to what our body clocks would like, and the average human body clock would like, let's say it's 26 hours, like studies have shown, that means that after 6 days, so less than a week, noon would now be midnight.
I don't think I'd like that very much.
Because now you're eating when it's dark out and you have to completely change your schedule because you can't do things outside. Like if you wanted to do some yard work, you're not going to be doing that unless you have a bunch of artificial light.
Right. Which isn't realistic.
Right. So we can't necessarily go to our own schedules we can make up a schedule and try to have that match with what a solar day is, but that solar day will slightly change and will shift.
So this is sounding kind of like a no-win scenario here.
Right. So the question is, how can we best adjust for that? And that's what that's what we're trying to address here. What is the best way of compensating for that? I think that with what we stated earlier, changing the length of a second is not feasible because of how frequently you would have to change it.
Right.
And for things where we're recording the start time and end time of an action, where seconds actually matter, which is typically smaller numbers, changing the length of a second would drastically affect those. If you're saying, how many days does this project take? You don't really care about the exact length of a second, and you don't even care if there are leap seconds. So when duration of a second matters, or the number of seconds exactly matters, the length of a second is incredibly critical. So it shouldn't be messed with. And I think that's probably the first axiom that we should be adhering to. Now, what about cyclic time? Because these are all problems that arise from cyclic time. You can adjust for that with daylight savings time. Kind of. Well, daylight savings time is a different way of dealing with it. That has to do with...
It's more utilizing the sun.
Using the solar day. Which, let's come back to daylight savings time. I don't want to quite work into that yet. But cyclic time. Should we use cyclic time? What are the benefits?
I mean, it makes it relatively easy to keep track of things and make it easy to do some sort of conversions, because I don't know about you, but I really don't want to be counting in seconds all the time.
Okay, that's fair. But you're still going to be kind of counting in multiples of seconds, saying 5 minutes is 5 sets of 60 seconds.
Right, but telling you 5 minutes is a little bit easier for you to grasp than 300 seconds.
Is it? Because 5 is a smaller number than 300?
Yes, that definitely plays into it. And part of it, too, is do we really think in seconds so much?
So here's a question. What if we redefine a minute to be 100 seconds? 3 minutes, 300 seconds. Is there anything difficult to understand about that? More difficult than if it's base 60 versus base 100. Because everything else you do in life is base 10.
Right.
10. Whenever you add a digit, it's 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million. So why on earth would we use 60 for seconds and minutes?
It's definitely weird.
But there is a reason for it. 60 and 24 seem like really, really arbitrary numbers. Have you ever realized, though, that it's really easy to divide them?
Yes.
60 and 24 are what's called highly composite numbers, which means that for each of them, any number smaller than them has fewer factors. What do I mean by factors? Factors for a number are what numbers can you multiply together, or what numbers can divide the number that you're asking about. So, for instance, 24. 24 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, and 12. So that has a lot of factors, and there are no numbers smaller than 24 that have more factors than 24. 60 is the same way. 60 also has more factors than 24, but there are no numbers less than 60 that have more factors than 60. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30.
Which is quite a bit.
It's quite a few. And specifically, 48 is also a highly composite number, which is smaller. It's also a multiple of 24. So why wouldn't we use that? The multiples of 48 don't transition smoothly. So in other words, 60 has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It doesn't skip any numbers. 48 does. 48 isn't divisible by 5. It is divisible by 6. Same thing with 36. 36 is not divisible by 5, but it is divisible by 6. So as you're climbing up 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. It's not as uniformly divisible. 60 is very nice in that regard because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then their counterparts. So that's one of the reasons that we have... That's basically the reason that 60 was chosen. At least theoretically, it was chosen back in the Mediterranean times when most humans were still in the Mediterranean. Several thousand years ago is, I believe, when base 60 was the idea, and then it was started to be used in timekeeping. 24, like I said, is also highly composite, so that is also beneficial to use for 60 times 60 times 24. All of them are very, very divisible.
Which is very helpful, actually, if you're thinking about time.
Right. Meet me there in a fifth of an hour.
Right.
A fifth we don't usually use.
But you could. Most of the time
Sure.
you hear, like,
It's
quarter past 3.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Absolutely. So highly composite numbers are beneficial when using cyclic time because it's easier to understand. It's specifically easier to divide. But everything else we do is in base 10, which is not as divisible, or at least not as highly composite. But if everything else we do, why don't we just define a minute as 100 seconds?
I mean, if we were to change the definition of a minute, that would run into similar things as changing the definition of a second.
To an extent. But if we treat a minute as a number of seconds, the length, like the recording of a duration of something in seconds will not change. The label of it will.
That's true.
So it's a simple conversion that you can do if it's absolutely necessary.
Right.
But
I think it'd be interesting to get people to consider that conversion.
Sure, but when the recording of seconds matters, the duration is just listed in seconds, generally speaking.
That's reasonable.
And that's kind of what I was thinking, is that it wouldn't change the length of a day. We would just change the number of minutes in a day.
And then potentially the number of hours.
Potentially, because it would be 100 seconds is in a minute and 100 minutes in an hour, which would be 10,000 seconds in an hour. 100 times 100. So 10,000 seconds in an hour, which means there would be 8.64 hours per day.
I don't really like keeping track of it like that.
It sounds really bad, and it won't round easily. But what if we just say that extra 0.64 hours, I don't know, let's treat it as a party time.
When are you going to put that extra 0.64 hours, though?
That's a good question. It also depends on when the day should end. So let's go back to just keeping track of time anyway. When does the day reset?
I mean, most people think about it becoming the next day at midnight, but even then, we just kind of arbitrarily decided when midnight was.
Sure. Midnight. When do you go to sleep?
Probably like 10.
Okay. I would say most people go to bed around 9 or 10. 9 or 10 p.m., which is, 21 or 2200 if you're using 24-hour clock, which you probably should, but we'll come back to that. When do you wake up? When do most people wake up?
Like 6, 7 a.m.
Yeah. I would say between, 6, 7, 8 a.m. is when most people wake up. Why is midnight not in the middle?
I mean, I'm much more awake in the evening.
Right. So we have the clock shifted that midnight is not when most people spend the middle of their night. It's the middle of the astronomical night, but it's not the middle of people's night. They tend to stay up later. So that also seems super arbitrary that the middle of the night is no longer the middle of the night because people can actually stay up later.
Right. But if we shifted our day to be when the middle of people's night tends to be, that would also shift the noon so that the sun wasn't straight overhead.
Right. So we can define, if we're defining things based on the sun, we want to keep it as approximately in sync with that. Why wouldn't we just have the start of every day be the sunrise?
I mean, that's not a bad idea.
So the problem is the time of the sunrise changes because of the axial tilt of the Earth. The time of sunrise changes, and it changes constantly.
That's true.
And it varies by a couple of hours throughout the year.
As y'all notice when you wake up sometimes and it's pitch black, other times the sun has risen well before you want to get up.
Right. So I think now is a good time to bring daylight savings time. We started with daylight savings time. 30 minutes later, we're coming back to daylight savings time. Daylight savings time has intentions and has a goal. Whether or not it meets those goals can be brought into question. But the goal of daylight savings time is to, during the summer months, give people more time in the sun after the workday. So it specifically pertains to, we have a general idea that between about 9 to 5 is when the standard business working hours are, and most people that are working regularly finish at around 5 o'clock. That's the standard labor force in the developed world. Agreed?
Yeah, that's pretty reasonable.
And it's been like that since basically partway through the Industrial Revolution is that when that happened, and when
something along those lines.
It's when work hours and work in general started becoming standardized, and working from sunup to sundown was no longer necessary, particularly when you're working inside a lot and you're no longer just agrarian and farming all the time. You didn't have to rely on the sun. And that led to 15-hour work days, which people revolted against and said, no, 8-hour days, 5 days a week. That became the standard of, this is not considered overworking people. Daylight savings time aims to reconcile that with the sun, because most people get up around the time of the sun coming up, and you want to make sure that you adjust the clocks to approximately adjust for that. That during the summer, when you have more daylight hours, if you turn the clocks back, in the spring, when you set the clocks forward an hour, what does that do to what time it is when the sun comes up? The sun effectively comes up earlier on the clock. Sorry, this is one of the reasons I hate daylight savings time, is the confusion around this. If I am looking at daylight savings time, all right, the sun is coming up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Now I enact daylight savings time, which springs forward. You put your clocks forward 1 hour, which means now the time is set at 7 o'clock. That means that the sun is rising at 7 o'clock. If I'm getting up at a consistent time, that means that the sun is rising 1 hour later. And that means that by the time I get home from leaving my normal 9 to 5 job, that the fact that the sun rose later means that I get that extra hour after I'm done with work.
Which is pretty nice.
It's super nice. But if that was the end goal, why not just always wake up in the morning? Or wake up before the sun is up?
Are there really a lot of people that want to do that, though?
True, but in the winter, it doesn't matter. You have to wake up before the sun because the sun isn't up. So, depending on where you live, the sun may not be up in the sky for more than 8 hours or more than 9 hours.
Right.
So you will be coming home when it's dark and you'll be getting up when it's dark. You don't really necessarily have a choice, again, depending on where you live. You would think this isn't a problem for farmers. A lot of people have... What's probably the most frequent reason that daylight savings time is good?
I mean, so that you have more light to work in, really.
For the farmers?
Yeah. Even for other people.
Historically, basically since the idea of daylight savings time was introduced, farmers have disliked the idea of daylight savings time.
What?
It has not been supported by farmers. It has been opposed by farmers under most circumstances. Do you know why?
No.
So farmers basically can harvest, plant, do work on the farm based on the sun. Specifically, working the fields or harvesting certain types of plants at particular times of day can change how hard it is to harvest, particularly with dew.
I can definitely see that, because if you've got dew all over your plants and you're going out to harvest, that could definitely clog up the machinery.
Right. One of the big problems with daylight savings time is if workers work based on the clock time. So if they always come in at, let's say, 8 in the morning. If 8 in the morning is before the sun rises or before the dew evaporates, that will change how effective your workers can be, because now they're fighting with wet crops. And so not only does it change the amount that you can get done, it changes the efficiency of I'm paying these workers to do this. And because of the fact that even if they're working the same amount of time and they carry the same amount, the fact that the material properties of the crops that I'm trying to harvest or work with in general are changing because it's at a different time of day and the sun is at a different point in the sky, it changes how costly it is, which means that daylight savings time, because it makes it more difficult to do things earlier on in the solar cycle, and workers don't change their schedules based on that. If your workers are adhering to a normal clock time and a normal work schedule, you lose money. Farmers, generally speaking, lose money because of daylight savings time.
Well, that's not terrible if you think about society as a whole.
How is farmers losing money not terrible?
I know. This sounds
literally
terrible.
Feed us.
They feed us, but they're also a very small subset of workers.
It's also a very important subset of workers. And a large portion of our resources, in terms of just land resources, goes to food. If we can make farming more efficient, we can more effectively use our land, use less land, and produce food more efficiently, which is one of our biggest wastes, is food. So if we can produce that more efficiently, we can cut back on our overall impact on the environment.
That's true. But would not switching the time really make it that much more efficient?
So that's a question. Does switching the time have other benefits? So switching the time for farmers has a negative impact. Are there other places that it has a positive impact?
Well, one of the big ones that I tend to think about is taking kids to school. Younger kids, you want them to get on the bus during daylight.
Sure.
You don't want to leave them at the bus stop. They're like a kindergartner in the dark. Not a great plan. So at least having the time align more with when you have sun, that's very helpful in that regard.
I think that's fair.
That's definitely more modern.
Now, you would also want them to be able to come home in daylight. So again, during the winter months, it doesn't really matter as much, and you're going to have that issue either way.
Right.
Also, when we have daylight savings time, when we change when the sun rises, we do that during the summer.
Yeah, so school doesn't matter so much.
Right.
There's also an argument that I've heard for saving electricity,
okay,
which is an interesting one, where the idea is, since people are coming home from work and there's still sun, they are using less light in their homes, and they're taking more advantage of the sunlight, so they would use less electricity.
Yep. That's a great point to bring up. That's actually one of the original reasons that it was proposed, which was back in the early 1900s. The first time that daylight savings time was actually implemented in countries in general was around World War I. And a lot of them dropped it, and they brought it back in World War II because of energy consumption, particularly artificial lighting. Artificial lighting accounts for... so first of all, residential power accounts for, I believe, a majority of first world energy consumption in terms of electricity. It's a huge amount because there are a huge number of houses. What do you think the biggest electrical draw in a household is?
Well, since you're phrasing it that way, I don't think it's their lighting.
It's not. Lighting, particularly as we've moved away from incandescence and then gone to fluorescence and then gone from fluorescence to LEDs, the amount of amount of electricity that a standard residential house uses, at least in the United States, is a couple of percent. I think it's something like 3 or 4% of their... No. Yeah. We just paused to look it up to verify. Approximately, if you're using only electricity, which if you're not using electricity, for instance, for heating, you're still using a similar amount of energy. So in terms of energy consumption, about 3% of that is actual lighting, between 3 and 5%. There's about an equivalent percentage for refrigeration, which most people in the modern world have. Other, not huge ones, but all other ones that we're not going to list are about 20 to 25%. And then the three big ones are water heating, which is about a quarter. Between a quarter and half is space heating. And then air conditioning is around 8%. So you spend about maybe 1.5 to 2.5 times the energy consumption doing air conditioning than you do lighting. And most people air condition their houses regardless of the time of day. They'll come home and it'll still be adjusted.
Right.
So lighting, now granted, you're going to be using electricity either way, but lighting is not the biggest impact. You're changing the way we use time to affect, not just save, but affect approximately a 3 to 5% energy usage. You're focusing really specifically.
Right. Like, you can make way bigger impacts with other things.
The other big problems with the idea of that is you're looking at saving a fraction of it. In modern times, it is really hard to convince people to go outside. We're more and more comfortably going inside for longer periods of time and using televisions or computers and using more and more electricity in that way, as opposed to going outside. So how much does it really matter if you get an extra hour if you're just going to be spending it mostly inside anyway? And considering air conditioning is going to be running regardless, because you want to come back into your house while it's air conditioned, even if you come home, your air conditioning will probably be on, even if you're outside.
Right. Because most people have it programmed to maybe be warmer while they're at work, which it doesn't really matter about the sunlight then, and then you'll cool it off when you get home.
Right. So changing that time doesn't really change the amount of air conditioning that you're using, which is a much bigger effect than bigger effect than lighting. So it's not really changing that. And even with the lighting, it's assuming that you're spending time outside, which is becoming increasingly small as technology improves and as we move forward in time. So it's because the potential positive effect of daylight savings time is decreasing. Even if you account for what the current amount of energy savings is. Overall household energy consumption, conservative estimates have put, when studies have been done on sort of like cross study, if you take 40 studies and compare them, the estimates of how much actual energy is saved in residential areas is on the order of 0.1 to 0.2%.
That's almost not enough to really measure.
Right. So it is bad for farmers because it increases the overall cost of their labor. It decreases their efficiency in terms of working with their crops. It might, based on estimates, save 0.1 to 0.2%. And it is becoming decreasingly useful as people spend more time inside. What are the disadvantages of daylight savings time? Can you think of any?
I mean, I just really hate it when we have to turn the clocks.
Do you know of anyone that likes changing the clocks?
Absolutely not.
It's a
I mean, when you fall back, it's kind of nice to get that extra hour of sleep, but that's really the only thing.
And in the spring, you lose an hour of sleep.
Right, so it's kind of a wash.
What would you rather have? Maintain a consistent sleep schedule and be able to sleep in and then in an unrelated time have to be woken up an hour early?
Yeah, I'd much rather be consistent.
I think most people would agree with that. So if people do like daylight savings time, it's generally because, the sun comes up at a different time. I get more sunlight. Why not just stay on that? And this is a question that has come up very frequently. Officially, and I looked it up before we had started this discussion, the EU in 2021 is officially saying we're no longer doing daylight savings time. Countries choose at the time that we're stopping this whether or not they want to have daylight savings time active or off, which just basically means which hour you're going to be on. So either +1 or +0, and stay there. No longer switch the clocks. So the European Union is doing that. Finally, something productive from them. And I think it's largely because they recognize that the advantages that it might have had are a very small might. And some of the problems that have been presented are the fact that there is a big spike in accidents around the time of switches.
That's definitely one that I've heard a lot of.
And it's not just because people are going to be sleepy, but for the people that forget about it, they may be late and end up going faster, driving more erratically, increasing that, particularly with old folks' homes, for people that are very sensitive to changes in their schedule. Heart attacks, the frequency of heart attacks also increases because of just stress, lack of sleep, and the older you are, the less likely you are to be able to handle that.
So daylight savings time could actually contribute to deaths.
Yes. Now, on the flip side of that, depending on the time that people are waking up, if daylight is available, it can also decrease the number of traffic incidents, even if the number of traffic incidents around the time shift drastically increases. But then the logical thing to do would be leave it on the time shifted area that decreases the number of crashes and don't shift it again.
Right.
Which is what the European Union is doing. The question is how many other countries may end up following that.
Right. I know in the U.S., I believe it was Arizona, actually doesn't switch their clocks.
Yep, but there is a territory within Arizona that does switch the clocks.
Right.
And that
Things
gets
get
really
weird.
confusing. But this also brings up the problem of just daylight savings time in general is trying to fit the clock, like a day clock or a clock day with a solar day. And the fact that things change, daylight savings time is an attempt at adjusting for that, but it's becoming increasingly completely irrelevant and more problematic than it is. In particular, computer systems.
Yes.
So, and you may think, oh, what do you mean? My computer handles it just fine. Like, it switches back and we do an hour again.
Which sounds great in theory, but what about if you're storing data? Say you recorded this thing happened at like 2:32 a.m. And then we switch the time back. So now we have 2:32 a.m. again.
Yeah. And you may think, well, so what? I can handle that. It's not that hard to think about. Computer systems have to be very careful when handling this. In particular, and as an example of, well, it's not putting anyone's life in danger, it absolutely is. Think if you're in a hospital bed. Let's say you need medication every hour because you have major heart problems or you just had open heart surgery or something. You need to have this medication once every hour. What happens when you skip an hour?
That's where things get weird.
You may miss medication. You may end up, or worse, if you, let's say you need medication once every 3 hours. And
you might get a double dose.
You don't want to overdose on it. If you redo an hour, you may get a double dose. And that can be very, very problematic for these regular types of drugs. Or if you are a patient that needed to get some sort of process done, you get it done, and then you get the repeat hour that the records may not match what the time says. And when you're talking about medical things that doing something twice can seriously put your life in danger, or skipping something can seriously put your life in danger, people can die or have permanent injuries as a ramification of it. So even if the computer system knows kind of how to handle it, and if you're careful about how you're giving medication, it still confuses everyone around giving that medication. And, well, did this person receive it? Because it says that they received it 5 minutes ago.
But was that 5 minutes ago
or was it an hour and 5 minutes ago? Exactly. So huge risks in terms of health, which is why for those of you that have never worked at a hospital, one of the things that they'll do during that time is they'll just shut the computer systems down. Like, these are healthcare computer systems are the types of systems that run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, with very few exceptions. Many times that time that they temporarily turn off the servers is during that time frame because they just don't want to deal with it. They switch back to paper for an hour and then turn the systems back on. Like, it's awful. And it's because it puts people at risk. So it puts people at risk in terms of traffic, puts people at risk in terms of the medical industry, but puts people at risk in terms of stress, lack of sleep, and potentially, like I said, there are increase in heart attacks. So switching the time, the act of actually changing the time, is really problematic. What are some solutions to that? Because daylight savings time, I think most people agree, and this is the crazy thing, is that most people seem to agree when you talk to them that, yeah, let's just get rid of daylight savings time. Let's just keep the clocks earlier. I like it. Let's stick with that. And that's what more and more countries are actually moving towards, but it takes a long time to get things pushed through government. So
Right.
what are some alternatives? We talk about axiomatic assumptions. What cyclic time, I think, is an axiomatic assumption. Is cyclic time good?
I mean, it makes it easy for people to understand time in general.
Sure.
Like-
And divisibility.
Right. It makes it easier for people to think about, okay, an hour is this long. And also making times for like an appointment.
Mhm.
It's easy to remember. I always have an appointment at 7:30 on Tuesdays.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if we were trying to go with something more linear,
You would have to add.
right.
Sure.
And I'm
And-
not going to keep track of that.
And I totally agree with that. I will point out, though, that computers do not use cyclic time. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
So for those of you that haven't heard, there's something called Unix Time. And it is, I'm a computer person. I have it on my watch. The current Unix time is 15737812253. If you're
Yeah, I'm not
curious
going to
of-
be reading that off to people.
No, and it doesn't mean anything. I didn't say thousands or millions. It's technically slightly over 1 billion. So the first number is billion. So it's 1,500,000,000 something. So if you're curious of when this podcast was recorded, that'll tell you what time it was. That number is the number of seconds that have passed since a particular time that was defined when Unix operating system started to become a thing. So that way, any computer system can say, okay, I want to compare these two dates. Well, were there leap years here? Were there not? Were there leap seconds? What is my time frame here? It doesn't matter. You look at the Unix timestamp between two times, regardless of how far apart they are, and you can tell exactly how many seconds there were between that. Do you think that that's beneficial?
I mean, that's great for computers.
It's great for computers. It's great for comparing dates. So there's a lot of benefits to it, but it's not human readable.
Right, which I think is a big problem because most of the time when we think of time, we need it to be human readable.
Right. Which, by the way, is why on my watch, yes, I have Unix time. I also have a normal 24-hour clock.
Thank goodness.
So I won't be missing any appointments anytime soon. At least not because my watch is off. Maybe if I'm forgetful, like someone we know.
I'll try to be better.
Okay. But like you said, Unix time is not useful for things like appointments, where you know at a particular time every day, a timeline where it's a strictly increasing time is not helpful. It's perfectly fine for computers, where they say, oh, just add 86,400 seconds. Yeah, that's easy. That's not easy for people.
Right.
So I think that computer systems should probably still be based on a linear time, strictly increasing number. Agreed?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable.
Because the math doesn't matter for them, and it allows for incredibly easy calculation of this timestamp minus this timestamp gives you the number of seconds that happened between them. Really easy time convert. And then you can convert that into human readable of how many days was that.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And it's easy to work with programmatically. Okay. Linear time makes sense for computers. For humans, probably not, because of the fact that we conform to the sun, specifically the sun on Earth.
I like that you put that in there.
Right. We're getting to the point with Elon Musk and a couple other folks that Elon Musk has explicitly stated, I want us to be an interplanetary species, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make that happen. Effectively. I'm paraphrasing. But when we have two different clocks, well, those clocks aren't going to match up. The length of a Martian day, called a sol, by the way, is slightly more than 24 hours. It's about 24 and a half hours. And for people that work on with the rovers on Mars, They can't conform to the Earth day. They conform to the Martian day, which means they have to change the time that their clocks wake them up by a half hour every day.
That would be really awkward.
But you get used to it. You can adjust to it. Now, that being said, they don't generally need to work in coordination with most of the rest of the workforce in the world.
That's true.
It
They'd be
may be
working with other
problematic.
people who do similar things.
When they're on basically the night shift, they may have to bring their own lunches and stuff, and they won't be able to go out for dinner as much. But it's not... You can work with it, particularly when it's a small group of people. But it is beneficial to have most of the workforce working at the same time.
Absolutely.
And taking advantage of the day. So if you're on different planets, you would just adhere to different schedules of, Mars would have a 24-and-a-half-hour clock, or maybe a slightly different number of seconds in a minute or seconds in an hour. Who knows? We don't know that yet.
They just have a different clock, probably.
Right. Maybe they would have a clock plus or freeze their clocks for 30 minutes a day. Who knows? But that brings up a different question of what do you do when you have people in different time zones? That I think we're agreeing that cyclic time for humans is useful, and relating it particularly either to a solar day or to a human sleep schedule. And while the solar day is still the dominant force in terms of overall waking up and going back to sleep, I think we should use the solar day, particularly on Earth since it's most applicable, as our basis for that cycle.
Agreed.
Because it's most useful right now. As we move more towards, computers maybe, or computer age of living out in space and there are no days, then we can switch it to the human waking cycle of how frequently do we need to sleep to maintain health. That's fine, but it's still approximately a day. And it'll still be cyclic. The question is, what happens when those cycles don't have the same reset point? So this is the question of time zones. Is it good to have hard lines between time zones? Because that's what we currently have. There are places where if you cross the street, you are now an hour in the past.
Which would be really weird if you live in those towns.
It takes a lot of getting used to. Or if you're an hour ahead. It also really hurts with coordinating. So for instance, let's say there's a big sporting event and you want to go to that sporting event. It's at X time. You forget that it's in a different time zone. Maybe you have to drive 4 hours to get there. And it's in a different time zone. You show up. The game's over.
Which sucks.
Right. Or you show up and you're an hour earlier than you intended to be. Now you're just standing around. So there are problems with those hard lines. What about smooth line transitions?
What do you mean by the smooth lines?
Should we have... So could you define a time zone based on exactly where the sun is overhead? Or have, at this latitude, your clock is off of UTC, which is Coordinated Universal Time, which, by the way, I have no idea why Coordinated Universal Time, CUT, abbreviates to UTC, but it does. I've heard it called two things, Coordinated Universal Time and Universal Coordinated Time. Neither of those orders matches with UTC. I have no idea why that is. But UTC is kind of the standard for here is the start point of a cyclic day. What if we just set the longitude that a particular location on the Earth is away from that starting point and say, all right, it's plus that many seconds. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I'm just imagining how in the world you would implement that, especially since people travel.
Right, and if you get in a car and you drive for an hour, your car may not be off by an hour. It will not be off by an hour. It might be off by 10 minutes. It may be off by 1 minute, depending on which direction you're driving, and you may arrive on time relative. Like if you leave, if you know that it takes let's say it takes 1 hour to make a drive, and you're driving in an east-west direction. Your clock may say you took exactly 1 hour, you left at 8, you wanted to get there at 9, you will not get there at 9. So a smooth transition is a terrible idea. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. What if there's no transition?
I mean, that could work, but it's also weird of me to think of noon here with the sun directly overhead and noon on the other side of the world where the sun is nowhere to be found.
Right. Specifically, noon for you at the opposite side of the Earth would be midnight.
Right.
But both would be considered, and on a 24-hour clock, so we're not resetting it every 12, which, by the way, 12 is also a highly composite number. So 12, 24, and 60. That's why the numbers are 12, 24, 60, because all of those are highly composite numbers. So on a 24-hour clock, okay, one place, noon, the sun is at the top of the highest point in the sky. Noon may also be an average sunset or an average sunrise, or it could be midnight. Is that a bad thing? Now, you said it would be weird. Once you get used to it, would it be a bad thing?
I don't think so. I think the people that travel would have the most problems with it.
I think it would be most beneficial for people that travel.
Why would you say that?
I need to be in a meeting, or I need to take a plane across the country. Normally right now, let's say that will, in the U.S., may cross 4 time zones.
Yeah.
Okay. So I need to be in a meeting later today, and I'm going to be crossing 5 time zones. I'm going to take off at 9 a.m. Well, 9 in the morning. I'm going to start using 24-hour speech. I'm going to take off at 9. I'm going to land at 13 relative to the time that relative to the area that I took off, but I'm going in a westwardly direction, which means I'm going ahead of the sun, which means I gain 4 hours, but it took me, or I gain time, but it took me I was flying for X amount of hours. What time will it be when I land? Now, it says that on your ticket, but if you're just trying to plan the flight I know it takes, let's say, 3 hours to fly across the country, and I'm going to cover 4 time zones. That means that I use 3 hours, but I gain 4 hours, so I might land at 8 in that case, which I don't think that's actually accurate in terms of overall times, and that means that you would be flying faster
Gives you
than
rough
the Earth
ideas.
rotates. Right. I'm just saying rough ideas, like there's math that you have to be jumping around. I think it would be easier to say, it is 9. I will take off at 9. That 9 is the same everywhere on the planet. I take off at 9. I am flying for 10 hours. When will I land? With local time when I get there. 19. Which is 7 p.m. on a 12-hour clock. But 10-hour flight, I land at 19. I can tell people that, let's say I'm communicating and saying, I need you to pick me up at a certain time. I know how long the flight is, or approximately how long the flight is. I need you to be there to pick me up at about 1900. That would make traveling significantly easier, and you would know what time it would be when you land.
But you also wouldn't necessarily know what it's like on the other side when you land.
Sure, in terms of lunch.
Right.
Or basically wake up and eating schedule.
Right. Because an area where the sun rises at 9 is going to look very different than an area where the sun rises at 13.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question. You take off at 9, again, on a 24-hour clock. So I'm just going to say numbers between 0 and 24. You take off at 9. You fly for 12 hours. You gain 3 hours based on time zone changes. When would be the next time after your flight that you would eat? How long would you have to wait to eat again? Assuming that you eat at lunch at 12.
Realistically, I'm just going to eat when I'm hungry.
Okay. Now let's say there are no time zones. I'm going to ask the same question. And let's say that you know, so again, in this previous example, you knew that people eat at 12, but you're doing a bunch of time zone changing. You know that you're going to have to eat at 12 in that local time. You couldn't figure it out, not easily.
Right.
I take off at 9. You have a 10-hour flight, and the people there eat at 0100. how long would you have to wait from the time of landing until you would then next eat?
My math's going fuzzy here. But
Take off at 9,
take off at 9.
fly for 10 hours,
10.
and they normally eat at 0100.
So that gets you to 1900.
Yep.
I'm over here being terrible counting on my fingers.
6.
Yeah.
I included a click over the normal cycle because we're not getting rid of the cycles, but 9, you land at 1900. You know that they eat at 0100, which means the difference between 1900 and 0100 is 6 hours.
You'd also have to know that they eat at 100.
Sure. But you knew in the previous example where we have time zones and you were adjusting for that of flying for 10 hours but -3, and I know that they eat at noon, you would have to calculate out the time that you would land and then from there also calculate out the next noon time. So it's an extra step if you include time zones as an extra subtraction or addition, depending on what the change is. But either way, you have to know what their time zone is rather than knowing. You don't have to have additional calculations if you just know when they eat.
But from the opposite side of this, you have to know when they eat. Most people would have lunch around somewhere like 11 to noon-ish.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm flying to another place and I see, oh, okay, now it is noon there,
sure,
that's when I would think to eat lunch.
But it makes the calculations easier. It makes making your plans significantly easier. Also, and I think more importantly, it makes meeting with people in other time zones also easier.
I can definitely understand that one.
You may not know, like, oh, well, I want to meet with you at 10. They may be eating at that time because maybe their 10 is, or at 10 for them is the middle of the day. That's when they normally eat.
But you also know that it's 10. You don't have to worry about the fact of, oh, I'm in this time zone and they're in that time zone.
Right. You don't have to know anything about their time zone. Maybe for politeness, you try to not schedule things around lunchtime, but lunchtime can change. It's not something that's hard set. If you say, hey, we're having a meeting at this time, please be ready for a call at this time. You don't have to worry about any time zone conversions or including, all right, be ready at this time in my time zone or this time in your time zone. You don't have to worry about it.
Which is pretty nice.
Yeah, it makes coordinating for international collaboration or even just national collaboration when you have multiple time zones. It's one of the reasons that China, despite the fact that it would normally cover, I think, 3, maybe 4 time zones, has 1 time zone.
Which just seems so weird, but hearing about it from like the meeting scheduling part, it makes sense.
In terms of meeting scheduling, traveling, it simplifies time tracking, particularly with, regardless of whether or not it's within Cyclic, but in Cyclic time tracking, having 1 time and just knowing, all right, I'm going to eat around this time every day, you can easily look that up. Of people normally, noon equivalent is this time.
That's true.
You don't have to worry about converting. You just have to know, all right, that's when I should be eating. And I should change my schedule around that. So I think that having only universal time, UTC, worldwide would be overall beneficial for tracking. You would still have a little bit of issues on the UTC line, where on the left of the line it's one day and on the right of the line it's another day.
But that would still drastically reduce the issues for everybody else.
Right. Actually, no, it wouldn't. Sorry, there wouldn't be a day change. Because all clocks are on the same clock, or everyone is on the same clock. So
Even better!
Whether or not you're on the left or the right, it's like, it doesn't matter where I am on the planet. It is this day. It is this day at this time.
Man, could you imagine trying to celebrate the new year with that?
Everyone on the planet would be celebrating at exactly the same time. Some people would have to stay up until 4 a.m.
It's still a weird concept to wrap my head around, though. If we're going to celebrate it at 4 a.m. as opposed to midnight. But that's kind of more of a converting type thing.
I actually really like the sentiment of that. Because it means that for one moment, for a few seconds of every year, every single person across the planet that wants to celebrate New Year's celebrates it at the same moment. Instead of, hey, we're in this time zone, we're going to do our thing. And then an hour later, hey, we're in this time zone, we're going to do our thing. We're doing it throughout the day. But I like the idea of we're all doing it at the same exact time.
It's definitely interesting.
It's something that makes traveling easier. It makes coordinating and working together with people throughout the world significantly easier. It makes figuring out exactly what day it is and what time it is also significantly easier. It makes tracking time of astronomical events, if you're interested in that. It makes that significantly easier. Anything related to where the sun is in the sky in terms of sunrises, what time does the sun rise? You don't have to worry about what time zone you're in. It makes that significantly simpler. If you want to change work schedule daylight savings time would still be a question of, do we get up for a normal work schedule an hour before or an hour later? You just change the time that you were waking up. So instead of waking up at 8, you might wake up at 7. But it's still doable. And we already talked about eliminating daylight savings time in general because that's being less applicable. So there's no negative of having only using UTC in terms of potential benefits of daylight savings time. You could still do it. And it helps bring the world together, not just in functionality of coordinating between each other and improving travel and making that easier, but it allows for one moment every year where everyone is celebrating the new year at the same time. And I think that as we become more connected, that's a really nice sentiment to have.
We need more good things in this world.
And of the things that could reasonably happen within my lifetime in terms of major changes of how people go about their days, I think switching over to everyone being on UTC, I might live to see that happen. And I think I'd like to see that. What about you?
I would too.
Cool.
There are worse things.
Let's leave it at that. I'm also really curious what everyone listening here thinks of these ideas, so let us know what you think in the comments.
Hi everyone! Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!